Hooking you in from the first line. What happens when a live TV legend and a top morning show co-anchor are forced to watch someone they love vanish into thin air? Today we are digging into the emotional gravity behind Katie Couric's reaction to Savannah Guthrie's family crisis, and what this reveals about the human side of televised news. I'm your host, and I want to unpack not just the timeline, but the undercurrents, the empathy, the pressures, the public scrutiny, and how these moments shape the culture of morning television. What matters here is not just the incident, but how it exposes the expectations placed on public figures when their personal lives collide with the spotlight. Personally, I think the real story is the quiet resilience it demands from people who routinely guide millions through tragedy. What makes this really interesting is how Couric frames her own grief as a lens to understand Guthrie's heartbreak, not as a compare and contrast, but as a shared human experience across generations of journalists. From my perspective, this isn't just about sympathy, it's about professional identity. Can you separate your own pain from the show, and should you have to? Let's break down the core ideas and then I'll offer 3 big takeaways you might not already be considering. Idea 1. The shared burden of public-facing grief. Commentary. Couric highlights a universal truth. When your job is to narrate others' lives during crises, your own story becomes part of the broadcast. That layering changes the stakes for both the audience and the anchor. Personally, I think this makes the job feel less glamorous and more sacrificial, because you're always carrying someone else's weight on air. In my opinion, the audience also reads it differently. The authenticity of grief can become a source of trust or a potential emotional trap if not handled with care. What many people don't realize is that anchors absorb the country's mood as well as its headlines. Their personal narratives become the country's shared memory, for better or worse. If you take a step back and think about it, this is a human version of "the show must go on," with a side of vulnerability that changes how we engage with news. Interpretation. Couric frames her own loss decades earlier as a pathway to empathize with Guthrie, suggesting that grief can recalibrate the newsroom's tempo from agog to humane. This implies that newsrooms could benefit from visibly modeling healthy grief processing, not as weakness but as a responsible rhetoric that helps viewers digest tragedy without sensationalism. Idea 2. Public figures as steadiness mechanisms during private storms. Commentary. The expectation that anchors remain steady in the eye of a storm is a cultural artifact of televised news dominance. Personally, I think the pressure to appear unfazed can mask the very real human limitations we all have. From my perspective, the moment Couric shares a personal parallel to Guthrie's situation is a strategic move that normalizes vulnerability without dissolving authority. What this really suggests is that reliability in media isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about channeling it into thoughtful, anchored commentary that helps the audience feel seen. A detail I find fascinating is how Couric's openness can inspire younger journalists to handle grief with boundaries that protect both the person and the platform. What this means for the industry: leadership includes modeling emotional intelligence, not just delivering facts. Idea 3. The role of public appeals and official channels in personal crises. Commentary. The article notes authorities asking for information in Guthrie's mother's case, which reframes the news cycle from just reporting to actively enabling resolution. What makes this interesting is watching how public figures leverage their platforms to encourage civic action without appearing sensationalist. In my opinion, this illustrates a broader trend: media personalities increasingly become conduits for public service, not merely content deliverers. What people misunderstand is that asking the public for tips is not a step away from empathy, it's a curated extension of communal care. If you zoom out, this pattern signals a more interconnected media ecosystem where journalism, community safety, and personal storytelling blend into one ongoing narrative. Deeper insight: the human dimension of newsworthiness. Commentary. This case exemplifies a larger trend. Audiences crave authenticity from their morning hosts, especially when tragedy touches real life. Personally, I think the emotional honesty, paired with clear channels for support and information, can deepen trust and loyalty. From my perspective, the convergence of personal grief and public duty might push networks to invest in more compassionate storytelling and trauma-informed journalism. This raises a deeper question: could this blueprint become a standard for how newsrooms cover personal crises with gravity and care, while still maintaining journalistic rigor? Closing thought: we watch the Today Show not just for the headlines, but for the human behind them. If we treat anchors like real people who navigate fear, grief, and responsibility, we may demand more thoughtful, less performative coverage from our media. A final takeaway: when public figures reveal their humanity in moments of weakness, they invite the audience to trust them more deeply, because trust, in journalism, is earned through both truth and tenderness. What do you think the balance should look like between showing emotion and preserving professional boundaries on live news?